Oix. That is the word. So this Greek word is where we derive the ecology from. And oix means dwelling place. Dwelling place or an habitat. So studying organisms and its environment, then that is what we call what? Ecology. Then the next thing is we have what we call types of ecology. If I want to study, am I going to study just one organism and its environment? So if I take just a single organism, I'm not saying all of you should know what organism is. I am an organism. So if you put me in a particular condition to know what I can do under that condition, then you are studying something. So when you study a single organism in its environment, we call it Autecology. So there are two types of ecology. Please don't get distracted. We have what we call Autecology. So Autecology is the studying of a single species. So you study a single species in its environment. That is what we call Autecology. So you can take a fish now and put it in a water condition and try to see the conditions that will favor that fish environment. Do you get my point? So just a single organism. So you can have like fish now, e.g. fish in probably aquarium. You know what we call aquarium? So then when you now want to study group of organisms, so single organism, don't let me put species, single organism, so that I don't get confused. Single organism in its environment. Then when you have several organisms, we call it Syncology. So groups of organisms is what this one focuses on. Are we there? So what is ecology? The study of living organisms and their environment. Abi? Then when we're studying a single organism and its environment, what do we call it? Autecology. When we are studying several organisms and their environment, what do we call it? Syncology. So they can ask you. And they can use an analogy that will not be like the direct definition. They can just say that a single fish was studied in a particular environment. This is categorized as A, ecosystem, B, Autecology, C, Syncology. Do you get my point clear? So now, when you're now talking about Autecology and Syncology, there are some concepts we use when we are talking about ecology. So we call this basic ecological concepts. Basic ecological concepts. So when you're talking about introduction to ecology, you hear a lot of terms. As much as possible, the first term that might be the lowest term is the organism itself. Abi? So a single individual that you are studying in that environment, that is the organism. Abi? So you can have organism. And you remember from hierarchy of living organism, we talked about cell, from cell to tissues, Abi, then from tissues to organ, then from organ to system. So please, if you have any question or something confusing, you should let me know. So when you're talking about a single individual, you're talking about an organism. It can be anything that shall live in. A single rat now is an organism. A plant can be an organism. Do you get that? So that single individual. But where does that individual lives? We call it the habitat. So what is an habitat? The natural dwelling place of an organism. Where an organism lives is what we call the habitat. Just get it clear. Are you there? So the natural dwelling place of an organism is called its habitat. And we have different types of habitats. Although we can have a very small habitat that we want to study, we call it microhabitat. Then we can have a large environment that we want to study, we call it macrohabitat. But on a bigger scale, macrohabitats or microhabitats can either be terrestrial can be terrestrial. So that means some organisms live on land, abi? We call it terrestrial organisms. And it can be aquatic. We are going to also spend much energy on both terrestrial and aquatic. For terrestrial, we'll focus on biomes. So we'll study biomes. For aquatic, we'll focus on the ocean, the brackish water, and the fresh water. So we'll study them maybe in the next class. Then for aquatic, then we have what we call arboreal. Pardon me if that spelling is not correct. So we have what we call arboreal. Arboreal is talking about organisms that live on the trees. So they can ask you, is that taken? So there are some organism now lives in which environment? We call it habitat, abi? So there are different environments organism can live. Organism can either be living on land, we call it terrestrial habitat. The ones that live in water, we call it what? Aquatic habitat. While the ones that live on plants, we call them arboreal habitats. Is that taken? Aquatic habitat is still divided into brackish, seawater, and the rivers, and what's that one? Fresh water. So we are going to talk about that later. Then terrestrial, we are going to focus on biomes. So we start talking about the mangrove swamp, the greeny savanna, Sudan savanna, Sahel, and the likes, and deserts. Please, I hope you are following, but we are still breaking it to the simplest. Now, when you talk about habitats, there is now what we call a niche. I do not know what your secondary school teacher called it, but my own teacher those days used to call it Nike. So we have what we call niche. And niche is talking about the environment and the function the organism performed. There's an organism in a particular environment, and that organism performs a specific function. What does that organism do in that environment? That is what we call niche. So when you're talking about environment and function, then you are talking about niche. But when you are talking about only environment, you are talking about habitat. Do you get the difference? So now, there are some blessed. This is not time to sleep. We have started live. Let me share the link. Oh, and my battery is getting low. Where is it? Somewhere. Joba Imuko, precious ship. You have power bank. Hey, Joba, before this thing will go off. Type C, right? So about me, let me. Then I sure the power bank has power. And provided this one will charge it. Open shell. So I hope you are following what we are doing. Even if you are writing notes, you should have written something from what I'm saying. So now, niche is talking about where you live. Home. Let me just home plus function. That is where you live and the role you play. Is that taken? So everybody has responsibility irrespective of where you find yourself. Now, example in biology, which you need to take notes, is aphid and caterpillar. So they can ask you about this. Aphid and caterpillar. This is the larval stage of a particular insect, abi, and this is also an insect. Both of them, they live on a plant, on a particular plant. Now, what does aphid does? It feeds on fluid in the stem. So aphid lives in the stem and continue to feed on fluid inside that stem. Oh, mama, draw it. That's what it feeds on. For caterpillar, where do you always have caterpillar on a plant? You would have remembered that they told you that caterpillar is destructive, abi, that it destroys leaves of plants. So caterpillar will be found on a leaves. So it feeds on that leaves and keeps destroying that leaves. So if they ask you now that where is the home of caterpillar on a plant, abi, what does it do around that plant? It continues to feed on the leaves of the plant. Do you get that? You know it will have effects on the plant because the plant that is supposed to use its own leaf for photosynthesis, but something is there destroying that leaf. So it has the effect, it has an effect on the plant. Do you get my point clear? So that is what we call niche. Now, when you move from niche, there's what we call population. So now starting with this guy, you have an organism. That organism has several organisms that look like itself. Then several of these organisms have the ability to interbreed with one another. Then they come together as a group. Then that group is what we call population. This is our population now. I can say, what is the population of everybody in this class? Abi, that means I want to know your total number. So the collection of organisms of the same species in a particular environment at a particular time is what we call what? Population. Do you get that? So organisms of the same species, so don't forget that word, same species. Organisms of the same species in a particular environment or at a given area, at a particular time, because it can keep changing. So same organism in a given area is what we call what? Population. Are you there? Now, when you now take several species together, like when I started this class now, you, cockroach, rats, bed bugs, and the likes, and the bacteria in your mouth. So then we call all of you community. Is that taking? So when you are know something, when you are focusing on, let me just say life, only life, without really talking about the effects of the environment, then you are focusing on organism, population, and community. These three is just, they are just focusing on the organism. When you have one organism, then that is organism. When you have one species, don't let me say one species per se, one living thing, a single individual, then you have what we call organism. Then when you have several individuals coming together in a particular area, it is called what? Population. Then when you have several species of organisms, different species, rat species, animal species, bird species, everything coming together, then we call it community. Do you get that? So now, we now have what we call ecosystem. Ecosystem. Ecosystem is now talking about the organisms and their environment. So all of these communities that you have gathered, what is the effect of the environment on that community? You can see how the growth is going. So now you have gathered community. What is the, it's not the same thing we are feeling here that some people that are under AC will be feeling. It's not the same way we are reacting or regulating our metabolic activities that some organisms under AC will be reacting. Please, as much as possible, do not lose your focus. Do not lose your focus when you are in class or when you are learning. And that's why you have to also maintain your health, like I said. Before you come to class, make sure you have slept at the appropriate time. And make sure that you don't come to class and sleep. Class, 1 hour of class will save you from 10 hours of reading. So don't stress it. Then food, make sure that you eat before you come to class. Some of you, like 100 times you have yawned in this class. And there are two conditions that can make you to be doing that: sleep and what? And hunger. Or let me see, allergy. As much as possible, there is, because I've been looking at all of you yawn, there's one yawn that has hunger since morning. Me too, I wanted to yawn, but it hangs to be by. Every time I see you yawn, I want to yawn too. So ecosystem is talking about, let me just put it like community and what? Environment. So the study of all living organisms and their natural environment is what we call community. So community now can sustain itself. All of you cannot survive now without depending on some things. You either depend on the animals you eat, you depend on plants you feed on, you depend on the air you breathe in, abi? So you depending on that air you breathe in, you survive. So everything about the air now and about you. Now, are you going to survive if you continue inhaling carbon monoxide? No, because it's dangerous to your health. So you have to study that condition in your environment and you yourself. So that's why ecosystem is also known as self-sustaining environment. So it is a self-sustaining region or environment that enables living organisms to survive. So then when you leave ecosystem, although we have what we call biomes, but I'm not going to put biomes here. We are going to stop biomes on its own, because biome is more of natural environment. Now, there is what we call biosphere. There's what we call biosphere. From the word bio and sphere is talking about the earth, the geography. Then bio means life. So everywhere in the whole world or on earth where life exists, where you can see life, is called a biosphere. So this is known as the largest community of organisms where you can actually see lives. So the largest space is what we have. Now, this biosphere, what always qualifies biosphere is that before you can say a place is a biosphere, life must be there. There must be life existing in such environment. And that's why we have 3 types of biosphere for basic level. We have what we call the atmosphere. I hope you are following. Then we have what we call the lithosphere. And which other one? We have what we call the hydrosphere. What is thermosphere? So, do you know that you have lives in the air? That is called the atmosphere. Atmosphere still has layers, ọ̀run méje. Atmosphere still has layers. That's where you have some organisms that will survive at that location. In chemistry, you still talk about stratosphere and others. Now, lithosphere. So atmosphere is just talking about the gaseous environment. If there's anything you need to take note of, I'll let you know. Then for lithosphere, it's just talking about the land parts, Abi. So the solid part of the biosphere is what we call lithosphere. The solid part. The gaseous part is what we call atmosphere, while the solid part is called lithosphere, from the word lit, land. Then we have what we call hydrosphere, which is the liquid part, Abi. So it's just like saying solid, gas, and liquid. Do you understand that? So there's an aquatic environment where you always have lives. So after you have understood what I've said here, can I clean the board? Now, you have what we call organization hierarchy. So we now have this hierarchy. So hierarchy is talking about how they follow. And I'm going to summarize all the whole stories I've said in a simple hierarchy. So we have an organism. Then this organism come together to form what we call population, right? But an organism can be studied. We call it Autecology. Abi, if it involves a single organism. Abi, when it involves several organisms, we call it Syncology. Are you there? So several organisms can come together to give us, so let me do this, a population. So populations are of the same species. Are you following? Then when you leave population, you go to where? Community. This same individual organism has where it lives. And this place where the organism lives, we call it the habitat, right? Now, that's where it lives. Then, what it does, we call it the niche, Abi. So the where it lives plus its role. Are you following? So where it lives plus its role, we call it the niche. Now, several of these population with other populations coming together, we call it community. So you have a community of rats, a community of animals. So everything coming together, then we call it community. Are you following? Then this community and what makes them to survive, then we call it ecosystem. So in an ecosystem, you have I'm going to still say some things about the ecological factors. So in an ecosystem, we have two major parts. We have what we call the biotic community and the abiotic factors. That means ecosystem studies the organism's community and the conditions that they survive on. So what are the organisms community? Something like producers, the consumers, the decomposers. So biotic is the community in an ecosystem that exhibits life and activities of life. While abiotic is not talking about the natural conditions that we have where there is no life. We are not talking about life now. That's why the word A means abiotic, no life, talking about no life. And there are a lot of abiotic factors. I'm going to talk about them separately. Example is temperature, Abi. Then we have rainfall, we have sunlight, we have wind, and so on and so forth. I will talk about that again under some basic factors. Then, what's the time? Then when you move from ecosystem, we start talking about, so in some cases, maybe in some questions, you can see biomes. You can see biomes as part of the hierarchy, it's okay. Then after biomes is biosphere, so that you don't get confused. That's why I include it. But I'm going to spend time on biomes very well in the next class. So for biosphere, we now have the atmosphere, Abi, we have the lithosphere, and we have the what? The hydrosphere. So these are just the introduction to ecology, or this is just the introduction. So now let's look at basic ecological factors that we have talked about. So what are these factors in an ecosystem that has effects on the habitat? Temperature has effects on the habitat. Rainfall has effects on the habitat. Do we know what we call producers? You have done nutrition, Abi. So you should know what producers are. You should know what consumers are. And you should know what the composers are. So for now, we will still talk about it too, but not to waste time on that. So now, let's talk about the ecological factors. Ecological factors. So ecological factors are basic factors. So these are factors that have effects or determines the bioactivity of organisms in a particular environment. So all those conditions that determines the activities of a particular organism in an environment, then we call it ecological factors. There are a lot of factors that can affect how, for example now, a soil can tell us how a plant will grow. A soil, depending on the type of the soil, so it can tell us how a plant will grow. So let's start from the first factor. Just call this one atmospheric factor. Atmospheric factor is talking about the availability of gases in the air. If oxygen is not present, you know what the effect will be. Abi, the person might not be able to breathe, the person might suffocate. There are some organisms that we call them aerobic organisms. They can only survive in the presence of oxygen. Abi, so you know the effect of CO2. So atmospheric factor is just talking about the collection of all of the gases you have in the atmosphere, which can have effects on the organism. And there's a circle those things undergo. For now, just list them. We have a lot of, so we're going to talk about nitrogen cycle later. We'll talk about carbon cycle. We'll talk about water cycle and the likes. So it's just an introduction. We have climatic factors. From the word climatic, these are factors that affect the climates, Abi, the atmosphere, the climates, the way everything looks. That is climatic factor. Anything that affects your changes in weather condition. So now you can have temperature, Abi. So climatic factor, part of it is temperature. Then we have light intensity, Abi. We have winds. We have even pressure. Can I rub this part? So moving forward, we have what we call edaphic factor. What's an edaphic factor? Anything that has to do with the soil, formation of the soil, the properties of the soil, the types of the soil. And quickly I will talk about soil. What did you say the time was? 10:53. So quickly, let me summarize some things about the soil. Although we are going to study soil, maybe I should hold on because there are some calculations we'll do on soil. So I can hold on for that. Let me continue. So when you're talking about everything about soil, then you're talking about edaphic factor. You want to study the types of soil. So we have the different types based on sizes. Based on their sizes, we have the gravel, which is the biggest and the largest size. We have the sand, which follows gravel, bigger than the rest. We have the silts, and we have the clay. So the tiniest of them all is clay. Some bigger sizes is silts. Then bigger than silts is sand. Then far bigger than sand is gravel. Do you get that? So when you're touching different types of soil, you can talk about how they look like. So the finest of the particles is seen in clay. Then you can talk about properties of soil, which I'm going to talk about later. The properties such as porosity. Porosity is talking about water retention. How do they retain water? You can also talk about capillarity. But in order to study this property, we are going to be focusing majorly on three types, depending on what we want to focus on, which is sand, clay, sandy soil, clayey soil, and loamy soil. So capillarity, aeration, and the likes. So I will explain all of these things in the next class. But let's move on. Now, adapting factor is focusing on what? On soil. So the texture of the soil, the types of the soil, and the properties of the soil. There are things you need to know. And which one is good for plants? Which one contains more nutrients? The amount of nutrients and all. So moving on from there, let's now look at, there's what we call physiological factors too. All these factors are factors such as diseases. Disease can have effects on a particular population. Disease, talking about predators and prey, talking about mode of nutrition. All of those things can also have effects on an organism in a particular environment. Is that taken? So now, I hope we are still following. We are just talking about some factors that can have effects. And most of these factors are, if you're talking about predators and prey, they are going to be biotic because they are going to be living. Abi? So if you're talking about nutrition, disease, it can be either related to biotic or abiotic conditions. So, but just know that biotic means living condition. Abiotic means non-living conditions. So now, in an environment, in habitats, there are some factors that affect each environment depending on what the environment is. Now, if you have an aquatic habitat, there are some factors that affect aquatic habitats. If you are talking about salinity, you don't talk about salinity on a terrestrial habitat. Salinity is talking about the amount of salt, present in your water. So, water that has a lot of salt, you can describe its salinity. We're going to talk about that. So, salinity can affect aquatic environment. For example, now, ocean. Ocean contains a lot of salt, compared to fresh water and compared to brackish. For fresh water, I hope we all remember this word: apotonic, hypertonic, and isotonic. If you are talking about salinity, if it is ocean, ocean is hypertonic to some level, isotonic to most of the organisms. Most organisms' salt condition balances the salt condition of the ocean. But for fresh water is usually hypotonic, isotonic to cell. So if you don't know what isotonic is now, hypotonic to cell. Then brackish. Most organisms in brackish need to find a way to regulate. So they deregulate their salt. That's why organisms around here now, if it is hypotonic to cell, that means that the cell has more salt concentration than the water environment. Except you don't know that. Now, if it has more salt concentration than the water environment, what's likely to happen to